All right, everyone, this is Greg Rehmke. I'm going to let him discuss his credentials for you, but we are meeting here today to talk about the STOA team policy transportation topic. Greg, thank you so much for meeting us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's an exciting topic, and I'm thrilled that STOA students are going to be researching and debating this topic through the school year.
As are we. We didn't realize that it was such a riveting topic, but as we discovered last week in Charlotte, it has far more topic matter than students realized at first.
Right.
Do go ahead for our listeners and students that don't know. Greg is an economist. He has written and done many notable things. I would let him outline them for you here.
So I have a degree in economics from the University of Washington. I've pursued my master's degree at San Jose State University. I'm the co-author with author of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Global Economics. But over the last more than 20 years, I've worked on national debate topics for high school debate and homeschool debate. And I see my task as trying to connect the debaters with the scholarly research from different think tanks and public policy institutes. I have a strong sort of pro-market background, but I think students, of course, have to study all different sides of the topic. But yeah, so I'm mostly, I hope to be a link between the transportation policy experts at different organizations, and plus my background's in economic history, so the history of things like transportation.
Awesome, awesome. So you are definitely very qualified to speak on this topic, and it's exciting. It is a very exciting topic. So I guess one of our first questions for you, and feel free, to bring up any topics that you feel are relevant to the discussion. One of our first topics for you is, where should a debater start in researching this and finding out what problems they want to address? What's a good starting point?
Well, I'd look in the current news. We have the current administration has called for major changes in U.S. transportation infrastructure. So look at what the Trump administration is proposing for highways and bridges and things like that. And that's an interesting background. The Obama administration was very innovative in space transportation, calling for the private sector to be more deeply involved in innovation and launching payloads into space. So, I study current events and current issues. The main research groups that work on this topic, the American Enterprise Institute, the Reason Foundation are two of the major ones, and the Cato Institute, all have books on transportation policy and research people who've worked on current reform topics.
Excellent, excellent. So, and one thing I think students haven't quite wrapped their head around is the fact that transportation policy is not just transportation as we know it, which we talked about last week. A lot of students, haven't really explored that space topic, or as you were bringing up in your topic talk last week and in camps down the road, there are even some transportation methods that maybe we haven't explored yet that could be looked at in this resolution.
Sure, and if you think about the reforms people want, you talk to people, what people will say, well, gosh, we have this huge problem with congestion. What's wrong? How come the highways are congested? And people say, well, there's too many cars. Well, so that's one perspective. How do we get people out of cars? People are going to say bicycles. What we need is a lot more bicycle lanes so people can ride bicycles. So there's all sorts of ways to look at the problems in the status quo. Mm-hmm. But as you dig through it, there's shipping, there's rail, there's light rail, there's air traffic control system, airports, airlines. The tendency of students is to accept things as they are. High school kids today think that traffic jams on freeways are unavoidable, normal. That's what there is. When I was in high school, I remember going to the University of Washington to play basketball one Saturday, and Interstate 5 stopped. The traffic stopped. And we all thought we were going to die. We had never been on a freeway in our lives that was stopped. So when the freeway system was built, the cars went 55, 60, 70, but they weren't stopped, rarely anywhere in the country. So that's something, it's always a shock to older people to have the freeways not really work at rush hour. But for younger people, they might take that for granted. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's solutions to that.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of those solutions, just looking at the congestion problem?
So I think for the debate topic, congestion is a great approach, a way of thinking about problems. Indeed. In my talk in the seminar, I mentioned that pricing is key for allocating scarce resources. So there's only so many seats at the movie theater, only so many hotel rooms. So what movie theater owners do is they charge higher prices at times when most people want to go to the movies, Friday and Saturday night. The prices are much lower during the afternoon, during the week. So they have a congestion pricing. If they charge the same all the time, they'd have huge lines on Friday and Saturday nights. Hotels charge higher prices at peak demand. So the proposal for freeway reform is to add congestion pricing. So when the freeway, there's too many cars that want to get on the freeway, you charge a fee, whether it's a toll or something through a smart card or something through your cell phone. So you'd pay an extra fee to be on the freeway at peak demand.
Right.
So that isn't a solution. I explained that to my father the other day, and he was very upset at the idea. He didn't want to give more money to the government. He said it's not going to work. But so you have to explain how this works. There's a ton of people on the freeway at rush hour who aren't going to work.
Right. Right.
And so putting prices on high demand assets is one way to manage congestion. Another is to build more movie theaters as a way to reduce congestion in movie theaters. Why don't we build more freeways? We've had a huge increase in cars. We haven't built more freeways much in the last 20, 30 years. So why is that? Well, that's federal policy that's diverted gas tax money to light rail, rapid transit, bicycle lanes, whatever. And it's just general philosophy against the car that we should, not have cars because they pollute or whatever.
Right. So if someone did not want to use cars as a means of transport, they didn't want to reform any sort of policy that had to do with automobiles as we know it, what other policy reformations are available to them?
Well, cars are pretty efficient for getting from place to place. But for example, buses are the best mass transit we have for most of America are buses. Only in Washington, D.C. and New York City are subways economical in the sense that they have enough traffic to justify the cost. Everywhere else are subsidized. But in light rail in Austin, in Portland, in most of the country, it diverts money from buses. It takes money away from buses. People have this view that they think light rail is great, but it usually doesn't work as well as buses in allowing people to get from place to place.
Exactly.
And now another thing, we're having a conference with electrons flying back and forth. Students are going to watch this through electrons. There's a lot of things you can do without going to the office. You can have virtual offices. So a lot of alternatives to taking yourself someplace else to work or for a seminar.
Right, exactly. A lot of our line of work is sitting here using those electrons, right? So for students who didn't, and I guess I should rephrase my question a little bit better. So we've talked about basically reforming policies that have to deal with roads, cars, like really easy forms of transportation that we know. There's also buses, light rails, subways, like you talked about. So what are some of those other areas that students could address policy-wise?
Well, for students who debated marine natural resources and don't want to do new research, they could use the Jones Act, right? The Jones Act restricts shipping. It says that you can't have a ship dock in one U.S. port and go to another U.S. port unless it's a U.S. flag port. Right. Reforming the Jones Act is one thing. I'll leave that to you guys to do. Students can find their own. But that's a major policy that's crippled the U.S. shipping industry.
Right.
And it's problematic in a lot of ways. So there's one.
Definitely.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead. I was just commenting on what you were saying.
Okay. Well, another is space transportation. The history of space transportation has to do with NASA as a development and research organization, got a man to the moon, the Saturn V, the space shuttle. But the challenge is NASA has always been a research and development organization. And by accident, they kept a monopoly control of space transportation. It's one thing to explore the universe or look around the moon or Mars or the moons of Jupiter, but just launching a payload from Earth to space, why should a government agency have a monopoly over that? Well, NASA has for decades, and that's why we haven't done more space, economists argue, is because it's been monopolized by NASA, and they haven't had the incentives, the ability to drop the costs. So now in the last couple years, we've had SpaceX, we've had Blue Origin, private companies, into space launching, but we still have a pushback from the federal government. We still have billions being spent by legacy military contractors, space contractors to build the super long-range rockets, very, very expensive. So fixing space transportation policy at the federal level, allowing private companies to handle the nuts and bolts of delivering payloads to space would be another kind of reform.
Right, right. And pioneering more of a private sector voice into space exploration would be an astronomical move. How would a company or an individual, unless you're Elon Musk, right? How would you take that step?
Well, part of it, the steps already been taken, in the sense that they brought private companies into
Right.
space. So then you'd look at why aren't private companies doing more? That is what's slowing down. We even 10 years ago, we expected private space to go faster. So there's something slowing down the program. There's cost issues, there's regulatory issues. So students researching Blue Origin, researching SpaceX, the federal government is funding part of this. The military is funding part of it. But there's more that can be done, I guess would be my point. It's worth looking into how do we streamline things and make them go better.
Right, right. So kind of shifting gears a little bit here. And I'm not going to talk about traveling the country in a covered wagon, but are there any forms of transportation that you would consider obsolete or will become obsolete soon and don't really deserve any policy initiatives? I know we've talked about Amtrak.
Yeah, so I mean, we have this generally students and judges would be opposed to socialism and government, government schools or government this, government that. Well, we have a government railroad system, and that's Amtrak. And it's very costly, very expensive. We have the state governments run, or the city governments run the New York subway and the Washington DC subway. And they are both disasters. They are both dangerous places where hundreds could be killed in fires any day because they're mismanaged and obsolete technology and various issues. So the federal government is partially responsible for continuing to subsidize these obsolete. The New York subway has got trains, technology a century old or decades and decades old. So how do you modernize that? What federal policy might modernize that? And there's other, so in some sense, the trains and the light rail are legacy technology. Students, it's worth looking into that. Almost all the economists are critical of investment in light rail. They're shiny, but they're generally advocated only by the companies that build them and by the elites in the city that want to have a light rail system. But that's also work because it hurts poor people who otherwise can't get from place to places by reducing buses. And this light rail doesn't work to me for very interesting reasons. There are some trains. There's a private train in Florida that's going from Miami up toward Fort Lauderdale and headed to Orlando. There are some private companies run the freight rail in this country, and there's innovations possible for commercial rail, high-speed rail. But what we've got is a system where the federal government tries to do high-speed rail, and then it becomes very expensive, high-speed rail.
Right, right. So, and the affordability and the accessibility of transportation is something that's become a big issue, especially now that you have private companies like Uber, Lyft, who are trying to make transportation much more accessible, maybe even more affordable. Like I know for Ethos, sometimes taking an Uber to the airport would be far more financially, sensible than renting a car for the week. So let's talk about that a little bit. We're going to have a jurisdiction problem because a lot of transportation is subsidized by the government. Then you have city-run transportation, which you just mentioned, and now you have private-run transportation, which is massively popular. So how should students deal with that? Obviously, you're going to need to know kind of what jurisdiction you're dealing with there. Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Well, it's a good question. And first, I should mention one more thing. Everything I've said has been critical of government transportation and positive on private. But consider that we have trains all around the country transporting oil that didn't used to be there. So a big issue in Seattle is these huge trains come through that are just packed full of oil from the new fracking operations. One got away somewhere in Canada and burnt down an entire small town, killed people. So And if the city of Seattle or the state of Washington wants to inspect these, make sure they're safe, you can't. Federal law prevents state and local government from even doing safety inspections on these trains. So that's an interesting story to look into if you were to talk to somebody, let's say on the left or on the other side,
Right.
to balance the other view, they would be very skeptical of private companies running huge oil trains that might not be safe enough and so forth. Now there's more to that, but that's another thing to look into there.
Interesting.
Back to your question on Uber and Lyft. So there is a possibility, all around the country, cities and states and airports are blocking Uber and Lyft.
Really?
Right? They're trying to regulate. The city of Austin banned them for a while. Then they let them in again. A lot of airports won't, like New Orleans Airport. When I was there, Uber and Lyft couldn't get there. They weren't allowed. You had to take these other systems. So what role could the federal government play in that? You could argue that the federal government should protect people's right of contract to, if you want to get a ride from somebody and they want to give you a ride, why should the state and local government stop you? So that sort of overrides federalism to say we have a right to contract with somebody voluntarily, and it's not for the city and the state to block it, because they're, like Mayor de Blasio in New York,
Right.
he accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars from the taxi industry and did everything he could to stop Uber and Lyft. And that's a disadvantage to everyday people, I would argue.
Right. So why were Uber and Lyft blocked? Just logistical reasons or financial reasons? Like airport taxi companies are losing money. What was the deal there?
Yeah, well, different claims are made. So in Austin, the city of Austin passed regulations saying that we need to fingerprint everybody and do a special background check if you want to drive Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft say, we have our own background checks. We have a company, we do it. We don't do fingerprinting. We don't want your system. So they just shut down. So the city of Austin people could say, hey, this was a safety issue. We're on the right. Uber and Lyft says, no, we operate all around the country with a higher safety record than taxis. In fact, the number of people killed by drunk drivers went up significantly when Uber and Lyft were banned in Austin. But there are, the claim of regulators is we're doing this in the name of safety, even though that often is protecting established van companies and taxi companies and so forth.
Interesting. Now, going back to sort of the issue of having some forms of transportation which are obsolete. So obviously space exploration is a little bit, it's not in the future, but us being able to travel regularly in space is pretty much in the future. Automobile is very popular right now. Trains, will we say that they're pretty much becoming obsolete since we're losing millions on them every day?
On the government monopolized trains, the Amtrak, and that's caused by various mismanagement issues in Amtrak, I would argue.
Right. So do you think that there is a really big potential for the private sector to save train transportation? There is an argument that it's a lot more economic than flying, even though you have companies like Southwest and United now, which are very effective at keeping costs low. United kind of has to, but.
Right. Well, so the one thing to think about on travel, so the big thing on the train is to focus on distances that are too far to drive by car and too short to fly.
Right.
Going from Houston to Dallas, Austin to Dallas.
Right.
You can drive it, but it's 5 or 6 hours.
Mm-hmm.
You can't fly it, but you're spending all this time in the airport and the flights are expensive.
Right.
So a high-speed train might be able to fit into that area. So that's, and one guy proposed a freeway where you could drive 150 miles an hour. That's another way to get from one place to another fast. That's the kind of technology that I think teenagers would appreciate.
It's a very German solution, right?
But thing to think about in transportation, though, is that I was talking about this in the workshop. Students might wonder, why do airplanes take off and go to 35,000 feet to get to their destination? Why not just fly straight there? The point is they need to get out of the atmosphere to the air is thin, because most of your energy in driving at 60 and 70 and 80 is pushing the air out of the way. So what Elon Musk and this Hyperloop technology is to build vacuum tubes with very low pressure, like air, like at 35,000 feet, and just throw vehicles down there at 200, 300, 500 miles an hour, whatever you want.
Right.
And that is a technology that sounds crazy, but it's actually being developed. They're building a test track in Las Vegas now. They're building one in Dubai in the next month or so. So Musk wants to build a LA to San Francisco one like that,
Right.
which isn't impossible. That's a technology we have. It's a question of how much money do they have to deploy it.
Right. Right. Okay, so and also in terms of making transportation more accessible, and we kind of did talk about those low cost options, and Uber and Lyft definitely is a really big part of that. But if the government or private companies wanted to make transportation more accessible, more economically feasible, what are some steps that could be taken there, if anything? I know that's like such a multifaceted issue. It's really hard.
There's a couple. So, for example, in air travel, we have a number of federal regulations that make air travel problematic.
Right.
And for example, and I'm blanking on the name of the federal agency at airports that slows everything up, the security people. They're the
PSA.
PSA.
Oh yeah.
Well, there was originally proposals and around the world, most of the airport security is done by private companies. I mean, if you want really strong airport security, you want to hire the company that does it in Israel. Israeli airports are going to have high-end security. So originally, the federal government said states and airports could have a waiver and get private security instead. I think maybe San Francisco and one other airport does, but the federal government has made it very difficult to get, private airport security instead of TSA. Changing rules like that would give you better access, and I would argue better safety issues in airports. That's one thing. Another airport regulation, so Air France or Lufthansa might fly to New York and then fly from New York to San Francisco. But US law prevents Lufthansa from picking up any passengers in New York to replace the ones that get off. Foreign carriers can't fly between US airports.
Interesting.
And that's no big deal in Switzerland and Germany, where the countries are so tiny compared to us. But it's a big deal in the US. So we have a huge number of international planes that are going from place to place that can't pick up passengers. That would reduce airfare costs in the US. So that's another change. Third one is Uber, Air Uber. Allow a company like Uber to, give people a ride for money. Right now, if you're a pilot in an airport and you want to give somebody a ride from one city to another and charge them $100 or $200, you can't do that.
Right.
The limits that. You have to have a pilot's commercial license, one thing and another. So you want to lift all those restrictions. And a fellow at our seminar in Charlotte, his congressman was actually proposed legislation to do that. And I don't know the status of that, but you want to reduce regulations for airplanes flying from place to place in the U.S. And that would reduce costs and problems for people flying.
As an economist, you've probably noticed like deregulation is a trend, and it definitely has like really awesome economic implications. So if we wanted to kind of apply that to other areas of transportation policy, where else do you think transportation could use some deregulation?
The management of highways, management. So this is actually probably the biggest part of the topic is the entire U.S. infrastructure system is declining and is headed toward a cliff. And this has to do with a number of things: federal government diverting money different places, cars hitting higher fuel standards so they don't pay as much gas tax. So we have the roads declining, hundreds, thousands of bridges that are dangerous are declining. So you've got to invest a lot of money in infrastructure to make things work better. And the question is, where are you going to get that money?
Right.
So the Trump administration has proposed allowing private sector investment to invest in infrastructure and then charge a toll. That's not appealing to everyday people to have to pay more for the freeways, but you've got to spend money to get the freeways to work. If you look at the numbers of what we lose because of potholes and poor quality, it's like a $1,200 per family, per person or per family, lost because of congestion and crummy roads. So that kind of deregulation, allowing more people to invest, allowing companies working on roads to charge local wages instead of union wages. That's another federal policy that basically gives unions sort of control over highway work and raises costs dramatically. There's other kinds of innovation. If you look at the way they build roads in Europe, it's different here. There's all sorts of ways to, so there's that, there's ways to make roads safer. We have 30,000 people a year die in highway accidents. That's crazy. And that's often mismanagement of the highway. There's a lot we can do with safety measures and other designs that would improve that.
That's awesome. What are some of those safety measures? Because I think, as we talked about last week in our workshop, that, car accidents and other various, things on the highway that have caused death over the past year, that's like the biggest killer in America right now.
Yeah.
And that's obscene. How do we address that?
So, I mean, the local roads or state level, the Harvard Center for Public Policy did research on what would save the most lives on roads, painting white lines on roads. The paint wears out and doesn't get repainted soon enough. That's a major problem, even though it doesn't sound like one. But when those lines are white or reflective and big, that keeps people from crossing off in one thing and another. So that's one issue of interest. There's technology. Truck drivers now, they have little gadgets that'll watch their eyes, and when they nod off, it'll beep to wake them up. I don't know to what extent those are deployed in the way they should, but same thing in cars. You could have, the technology now is pretty inexpensive to have alert systems in cars that could avoid, keep you from crossing lanes, stop people from, falling asleep and things like that. Now, I don't know if that calls for more federal regulation, but you want to improve safety standards and, look at the different options for doing that. Oh, here's another big one. A big part of the federal government national transportation policy is mileage regulations. They're demanding that cars get the fleet have a certain average mileage. The Obama administration was pushing it up to like 50 miles a gallon by the next 5 years. That policy kills people because the cars with higher mileage are lighter and people die when they get in accidents with those cars.
Right.
So there's debate on this stuff, but pushing toward higher mileage standards means you put more people in tiny cars that they die when they get in an accident. So, we used to have a problem. People were afraid we run out of oil. We didn't want to import oil. Now we've got tons of oil. We can't ship it out of here fast enough. And so, our cars get great mileage, but pushing them the next step is a problem. We shouldn't. Those policies are costly.
Great point. I hadn't considered that about the weight issue causing death. So alternatively, if you were negative on this resolution, which many teams will be at some point in their career during this year, hopefully, what are some things you could argue aside from just arguing that the affirmative case has issues itself? Do you see any issues with the resolution itself if a negative team wanted to take that stance?
Yeah, so the negatives got to attack each of these reforms, and there's a bunch of different ways I think to do it. One is a lot of the reforms are sort of halfway. So if the affirmative says, we think mileage standards are terrible, they're killing people, and we're going to stop the Obama administration's proposal to raise it to 50 miles a gallon. And the negative says, oh, so you're just going to keep it at 40 and let all these people die that are dying now?
Right.
So often these policies don't go far enough, you could argue. Now, if they completely eliminated the mileage standards, I guess then you would argue that people are going to be driving tanks and super low mileage. I'm not sure what you'd say, but I think a lot of these policies are half steps, and the challenge with half steps is they're have half the results. They're not going to be as effective, and the negative can go at it that way. The negative, of course, has traditional arguments to say, look, we've got to conserve fuel, we want to reduce global warming, we want to do all these other things, and so they can use those arguments as well. So those are some of the thoughts. For people's congestion pricing, the proposal to put a fee on people at rush hour, that's going to generate a ton of money. The affirmative is going to say, we're going to make it, let's say, revenue neutral, so people will pay less other taxes, or we'll use this money to expand the infrastructure and put more capacity in. The negative could say, well, has that ever worked before? Doesn't government always take every dime they get and spend it and then borrow more? So right. The concern about people paying tolls or congestion fees is the government's going to use it to spend on all sorts of things and not do what they say they're going to do with it.
Right.
A proposal.
I know in a lot of states, for example, where I live in South Carolina, there's a gas tax that's pretty high, and it was recently instated. And the goal, obviously, is to improve infrastructure. And you can see that happening. It's very frustrating because you don't get anywhere in any sort of good amount of time because of all the work. And a lot of accidents have happened because very suddenly there's road work, and that's not always like well indicated. So that's happening in a lot of the United States. But do you know, like off the top of your head, any other reforms that have already been initiated that you'd like to see policymakers and students kind of give a little push?
Well, so just take, I mean, the way economists look at things, when the highways are congested, people suffer, but do the people that manage the highways suffer,
Okay.
right? So one of the challenges with repair work on the roads is the incentives to the people that are doing the repairs. So, if their budget is cut for every, minute or hour people are delayed, then they would change the way they do the repairs.
Right.
And so you want to incentivize the people doing repairs to cause the least amount of delay and congestion for others. And it's how those contracts are managed. And so that's something that's more complicated, maybe more subtle, but you could argue it would save lives if people would follow different procedures, put up more lights, do things different ways, different times. And they're often constrained by having to pay double time and triple time for people working at other hours. So I don't know specific, but that would be one thing there. Deregulating transportation, letting people build more roads.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Seattle, I mentioned in the talk, Weyerhaeuser owns a lot of timberland around Seattle. They proposed building their own freeway on their own property, bypassing all of Seattle.
Right.
And that would be expensive, but it would allow development in their own property. And the state of Washington said, no, you can't do that. We have a master plan for development, and we're not going to let you build your own road. Well, the federal government should encourage private companies building freeways, trains, highways, airports, all sorts of alternative infrastructure.
Right.
And anytime the state tries to block people's efforts to do that, the federal government, I think, should step in and be very skeptical about those policies, whether it's regulating Uber and Lyft or Air
Right.
Uber or other private roads and so forth.
And I think we had discussed earlier about, certain tech companies, especially that have even built maybe villages for their employees just to, for the ease of transportation, because delay is such a moneymaker or like waster of our funds every year. And I think another issue that we had discussed at length at our workshop was the private building of freeways and how that's not always a great thing for investors. So it may be a hard initiative to spur. So if you would just kind of talk about that for a little bit and the history behind that and why investors may be a little skeptical to invest in private roads.
So around the world, so the Reason Foundation is the major resource in this area. They have an annual privatization report. I worked on it when I was there in the 1980s. So they've had a privatization report every year. And part of it is transportation privatization. So when China turned to free markets, private companies from Hong Kong were building a lot of the freeways. There's a huge ring road around Rome, Italy, that's run by a private company, built by a private company, run by a private company. So there's private freeways all around the world, private airports, private air traffic control systems. But there's also failures. Private companies sometimes succeed, sometimes fail. So a private company building a lot of freeways in Mexico went bankrupt. The private firm that bought one of the freeways in Indiana, I think, went under. The financial crisis hit a lot of these countries and they declined. But the thing, if you want to think out of the box, like in Los Angeles, you think, gosh, the freeways are jammed in LA, what can you do? Well, you could privatize the land under the freeway and let private companies dig a tunnel and run a highway down it. Elon Musk wants to do that as well. Or you could privatize the space over the freeway. Private companies would go in and rent that space over the freeway and build a second deck, run a 6 to 8 lane freeway down it, and charge people. Let the everyday people who don't want to go on that go on the regular, but you could divert a lot of traffic up there. And in LA, you could charge people $10 each way, sometimes $20 at rush hour, because they want to get from one place to the other. Right. And if you want to make sure poor people get a ride, you can give them vouchers and let them, get on the freeway too. The key is to have prices for scarce resources.
Love it. Love it. All right, so I guess we'll just kind of wrap up here and say, do you have in summation any final thoughts for debaters, anything that you would like to see them explore in this resolution specifically?
Well, technology is cool. So drones can transport odds and ends. Flying cars, there's a bunch of companies building flying cars.
And
Uh,
self-driving cars, Tesla.
Self-driving cars are a big thing. And there's articles, there's a speaker writing on that now who argues you need major policy changes for self-driving cars to work for various regulatory reasons. So there's a range of things trying to get our, the light rail system. What if you could run cars down the light rail in between the trains? Well, that sounds crazy, but you've got this infrastructure with space, and in Seattle, the light rail goes through every 15 minutes, and you've got this.
Right.
So I don't know the best way to handle that, but you want to have incentives that improve the delivery of services. There's hotels, traveling hotels now, where you get in, you rent a room, and you get in your pod in LA, and 6 hours later you wake up in San Francisco, and you're in a little pod with a TV. So there's all sorts of innovation and sort of nifty ideas coming down the road, and you want to look for areas that incentivize private companies or allow competition. And we're concerned about safety, the best safety we can get, but we also want to have more choice and variety in getting from place to place.
Love it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Greg. We really appreciate it.
I'll give you some links to follow up with some of these things too that you can
That'd
post.
be great. Yeah, we would put that in the YouTube description. So what's going to happen is we're probably going to post this on YouTube and then put it on our blog.
Okay.
And then I can send you the link and you'll see it on our Facebook page and all that when it's up. But this will be published Thursday. Tomorrow we are publishing a interview with a political science PhD on his thoughts on preemptive war. War veteran as well. So that was an interesting discussion.
Okay.
So yeah, your time to shine will be Thursday.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate being able to share these thoughts.
Definitely. Anything else we can do for you? I mean, you've done so much for us, so thank you.
No, I'm happy to respond to people. If people ask you questions, let me know. I'll try and respond. And again, I want to connect people to the experts. Rick Geddes at Cornell and AEI, Robert Poole at Reason, Sam Staley at Florida State, Adrian Moore at Reason. These are guys that have done research and worked on this for years, and they're the research is really interesting in all this, and it's worth looking into. And
that's another question I could ask you. What resources should we point debaters to? I mean, I know you will send me links, but just off the top of your head, what should debaters investigate for themselves?
Well, there's a lot of people write on these issues. Atlantic Magazine has had a infrastructure transportation summit in December. Rick Geddes was one of the speakers, but many others were as well. Mm-hmm. Reforms looking to send more of this to the states, look at reducing the gas tax that goes to the federal government, having more at the state. So you just localize it and let the local government handle everything that doesn't need federal. Why should the federal government be involving itself in mass transit in Portland?
Right.
Portland, all in Portland, and maybe a little Vancouver, Washington. So changing the institutional infrastructure is not ideological. This is not a right-wing, left-wing deal. It's just saying the federal government got into this for various reasons. The interstate freeway system was built for war, right? So that the troops could get from East and West Coast, so it has to carry tanks and so forth. It's been a boon for the private sector, but the federal government maybe doesn't need to be involved in most of these things the way it has been in past decades.
Lovely. Awesome. Really good thoughts, Greg. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your Monday night for your expertise to benefit debaters. And you have such a heart for debaters and students in general. So thank you so much for all the hard work you're doing and for touring with us all summer and for meeting with us to do this interview. You're really going to help debaters get ahead.
Thank you. I'm happy to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. Well, we will see you in Tulsa, I believe. Yep. And I will look into getting you Skyped into Salt Lake too.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay. Bye.